welcome to the Lone Star Collective, the official podcast of the Texas Cannabis Collective. I'm your host, Chris Grisolia, and I am joined this week by our very special guest, Morgan Fox. How are you doing, Morgan?
I'm doing pretty well. Thanks for having me.
We're glad to have you. Morgan is the National Norml's political director, correct?
That's right.
We're glad to have you on the show today. Tell us a little bit about what's going on with National Norml and all the things. I'm sure a lot of people want some updates on the MORE Act and all that kind of stuff. What's your involvement in all that?
Well, as political director, I'm Norml's chief congressional lobbyist. And so I've been spending quite a bit of time up on Capitol Hill trying to make sure that we can at least get some incremental reforms passed during the 118th Congress. General dysfunction, especially in the House, has created some challenges that are going to be difficult for us to get over. But I do see some rays of hope. Already we've seen dozens of cannabis policy reform bills introduced in various chambers. We saw the first ever markup hearing and approval of cannabis banking policy reform in the Senate Banking Committee. First time that bill has ever made it to a committee markup. And on the House side, we saw committee approval for the CURE Act, which would, as originally written, it was supposed to protect federal employees or applicants from discrimination for both past and current cannabis use, as well as protecting people who have security clearances. In order to get a markup on that bill, the primary Democratic sponsor made a deal with the head of the Oversight Committee to remove the current use language in order to help fast track this thing. So it did go up for a markup in the House Oversight Committee in September and passed by a huge bipartisan margin. I think it was 30-14. But right now, I think that we're in somewhat unprecedented conditions, and getting anything through the House right now, I think is going to be a little bit difficult. Not necessarily because there's strong opposition to cannabis policy reform, but simply because there's so much political infighting, both between parties and within parties themselves on various issues. And also, cannabis policy reform is seen as a relatively low priority issue for all but a handful of members of Congress, largely because they're not hearing from their constituents that it's an important issue, even though recent polling has shown that it actually is an important issue across the board, slightly less so for conservatives than for liberals and Democrats and Republicans, et cetera, but definitely still growing on the priority list. But as usual, politicians are a little bit slow to pick up on the will of the people. Now, when you're looking at a situation where there's so much partisan rancor and so much intra and inter-party fighting and a very limited amount of time to actually get anything on the congressional schedule in either chamber before the 2024 campaign season starts to really ramp up, I think that the prioritization of this issue among lawmakers is really a problem for us. Now, that being said, I don't think it's impossible. But I think that it's going to be very difficult for us to get anything completely passed. Now, we do have some opportunities in the appropriations process, but government spending is by far the most contentious issue that Congress is dealing with. So that creates all new wrinkles. But, I do think that we've got some opportunities in the rest of the session right now, not only to introduce new bills reintroduce bills from previous sessions in order to continue socializing them, to use them as placeholders and messaging legislation, but also to start gathering co-sponsors for both those as well as bills that have already been introduced, and really start to show bipartisan support for all of these more incremental measures, as well as some of the more comprehensive ones, like you mentioned the MORE Act, or Nancy Mace's States Reform Act, or hasn't been introduced yet, but potentially David Joyce's States Act. I think that we have a lot of opportunity to do a lot of education, even if the normal legislative order becomes untenable for us to get what many lawmakers still consider a fringe issue, actual time on the committee schedule.
Yeah, you touched on a key point there that's kind of pet peeve of mine, largely because our lieutenant governor here in Texas, I'm sure you've heard his quotes in the past year when he's asked about legalizing cannabis or marijuana. And his quote is, "I just don't think the people of Texas are there yet." Yet every poll says that between 60 and 70%, the latest was 67% here in Texas back in January, right as the session was beginning. And 67% of 29 million people is a lot of people. but we don't see that activity, with the lawmakers and people letting their feelings be known. And that's one of the things that my key message is: you've got to at least reach out to your lawmakers and let them know how you feel.
Absolutely. And some of the just the arrogance and hubris that we're seeing from public officials on this issue across the country is just staggering. I mean, bringing it back to Ohio for a second, immediately after the passage of issue 2 there, you had elected officials coming out and saying that, and high level elected officials just basically saying, oh, well, we don't think that the voters of Ohio actually understood what they were voting for. How insulting is that?
Yeah. I mean, come on, let's be real. That's ranked right up there with our lieutenant governor's statement about the people of Texas not being there, because the vast majority is there, just like the vast majority knew what they were voting for in Ohio. I mean, let's be real. I mean,
what they mean is that their donors aren't there yet.
Yeah, that's just what I was fixing to say. It means the money hasn't come across their desk in the right way. I mean, unfortunately, that's kind of how our political system works, especially at the national level. I mean, it's a much bigger subject at the national level, I think, than at the state level.
Well, at the national level, everything moves slower too.
Yeah. What is your take? We're just past a year from President Biden's big statement about pardoning small possession people, offenders, and also the request to review the scheduling of cannabis. What's your take on that, and where we're at, and where you think we might be headed?
So I don't want to understate the importance of a sitting president finally recognizing that having a criminal record for cannabis hurts you much more than any harms caused by cannabis to the consumer or society, and recognizing that cannabis has medical uses. That's never happened before with a sitting president. All right, so that is important, and actually taking action to start to do something about that with ordering the pardons of people with simple federal possession charges, and calling for a federal agency scheduling review. Those are all very important. Now, unfortunately, we saw that actually granting the pardon certificates took a really long time and is still ongoing. There are still a lot of people that are waiting for those pardon certificates, and without the certificate, the pardon doesn't really mean much. It makes it impossible to prove it, other than pointing people to like media coverage, right?
Yeah.
So the people that those arrests and convictions and records are really affecting are, I think, still waiting on them. I think that the certificates have started to be sent out, but we still got a long way to go.
Yeah.
I think the big problem with the scheduling is that the whole process has been completely opaque. We didn't hear anything about it other than that, federal agencies are considering it. Every once in a while, you'd hear an official from HHS say, yeah, we're looking into it. The process is ongoing, et cetera. But as far as I could tell, there was no public input and no reporting on progress that was really meaningful to the people that are watching this process. And then, in September, or it was either September or August, but either way, a couple of months ago, the letter to HHS to the DEA, which has final authority on scheduling, gets leaked. Now, to this day, nobody knows what that letter says. At least nobody that's actually willing to talk about it. This thing has been like Freedom of Information Act up the wazoo. And the only release that we've gotten was something that was so heavily redacted as to be basically meaningless. It didn't even say Schedule 3 in there. All we know is that supposedly this letter is telling DEA to reschedule to Schedule 3. Now, any sort of the scientific issues involved in scheduling, DEA is supposed to listen to the advice of HHS and not have control over that. However, some years back, DEA instituted an entirely different criteria for determining the appropriate scheduling of any psychoactive substance or drug. And that was designed specifically to do an end run around HHS's recommendations and mean that they could still actually have input on the various science and have that override HHS's recommendations. Now, if we look at the history of petitions to reschedule or deschedule for the DEA, we've seen that they like to take their time. Norml has been involved in lawsuits against the DEA and various petitions to the DEA to change cannabis' schedule and remove it from Schedule 1. And, in some cases, these the petitions and the legal processes around them took years, if not decades, only to be ultimately denied.
Yeah.
I don't think that considering that this is a relatively unprecedented area, and also there's no precedent for making a substance like cannabis a Schedule III substance. So we're talking about an unprecedented situation here where we don't really have that much information to go on, and officials are being very tight-lipped about the internal and external processes. So I think bottom line is that we don't know what's going to happen with scheduling over the next 9 to 13 months. But what we do know, and this is something that my colleague Paul Armentano has written about extensively in a number of media outlets since that HHS letter was leaked, is that while we appreciate the fact that there is scheduling review going on and that there is a recognition that cannabis does not belong in Schedule I, Schedule III does nothing to alleviate the conflict between state and federal laws. It doesn't really do much for research at all. It may or may not help cannabis businesses with the 280E tax issue, but that's not certain either. Aside from that, there's really not much that we can really point to as being a certain benefit to moving to Schedule III. There's also the unknown area where if a substance is Schedule III, then in order for it to be legally sold, it has to be approved by the FDA. The FDA couldn't even get its business together to regulate CBD outside of Epidiolex, and has been punting to Congress, and Congress has been trying to put pressure on them to take over or do their responsibilities, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's really unclear to what extent the FDA even has the capability to step into this role, but also because cannabis is unlike any other like FDA approved substance, we really have to worry about to what extent the FDA would then force Schedule III rules on cannabis, because every single state medical and adult use program would be out of step with every other Schedule III substance and would still be in conflict with federal law. So does that mean that we're still going to have the status quo where the FDA is going to follow the Department of Justice's lead and not interfere with anybody that is in compliance with state laws? Or does it mean they're going to start cracking down and forcing any single medical or adult use program into a pharmacy and prescription model 10 years down the road when they finally get around to actually figuring out a regulatory structure and approval through the normal FDA processes?
Yeah. Totally understand that.
Long story short, Schedule III is not good enough. We need to deschedule cannabis.
Agreed, 100%. With that being said, we're going to have to take a quick sponsor break. And when we come back, I want to dig into what your ideas are about how we can get more people involved with getting involved with their lawmakers, letting them know how they feel when we come back. So we're going to take a quick sponsor break. And when we come back, we're going to do just that. We're going to dive in to hear what Morgan has to say about how we can get you more involved with your lawmakers right after this.
Howdy, Colt Power here. These days, many people are choosing to add CBD to their wellness routine. Why? Some like CBD for how it may help them with their focus. Others enjoy the way the plant compound may assist them with their sore muscles and relaxation. For me, CBD has been a game changer in keeping my old sports injuries managed so I can work out and be present for my family. If you've ever been curious about CBD, I invite you to check out our Texas-grown, Texas-made products at powerbiofarms.com. That's power, BIOPHARMS.com.
Thrive Apothecary offers an experience truly unique from anything else in Texas. A full-service cannabis solution that is doctor-owned and offers customers every level of cannabis legally available in Texas. From traditional CBD products to emerging hemp-derived THC edibles, smokables, and now medical cannabis. As a licensed medical cannabis provider, prospective patients from anywhere in Texas can book a sponsored online eligibility consultation to determine if they qualify for a medical marijuana prescription from the comfort of their own home. Visit thrivetx.com for more information.
Welcome back to the Lone Star Collective podcast, the official podcast of the Texas Cannabis Collective, distributed on Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts, and many more, to give Texans information regarding policy, industry, and culture. And now, back to this week's show.
Welcome back to the Lone Star Collective, the official podcast of the Texas Cannabis Collective. I'm joined this week by our very special guest, Morgan Fox, the National Norml's political director. Welcome back, Morgan. Just as we were going to the break, we talked about picking your brain a little bit on how we can get some of these people involved, some of these people that answer polls positively where cannabis and marijuana law reform is concerned, but don't necessarily reach out to their lawmakers when the appropriate times present themselves. How can we reach out to these people and number one, stress the importance to them and get them to understand the importance, and number two, get them to get involved with the process, and number three, get them to understand how simple the process can be with various email campaigns and whatnot that other organizations put out there.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the real core of the issue is making sure that people understand that lawmakers actually do pay attention when their constituents reach out to them, especially if they do so in large numbers and in a respectful and well-informed fashion, and can actually talk about the issue. But there also have to be numbers. So I think that another very important point, like you mentioned, is making sure that it's as easy as possible for voters or supporters to actually do this. But I think one of the biggest problems that we've run into is that, especially since Norml as a cannabis consumer advocacy, most of our contacts are cannabis consumers, and for many people, and I can't really blame them for this, when they have legal access to cannabis in their state, their interest in being like staunch and strong advocates tends to wane, and I can't fault anybody for that. But there's a lot more to cannabis policy reform than just having legal access in your state. Which, by the way, does not happen without a lot of people getting very heavily involved in their state and local political processes.
Absolutely.
I mean, the bottom line is that change does not happen unless people get involved and push the things that they want to have happen. Because without that, you can be completely right on a policy issue. Nothing's going to happen unless the people that hold the keys recognize that they have incentives in order to get those passed. Obviously, some people are just going to want to do the right thing in terms of public officials. But if you want to get all the rest of them that are necessary in order to pass bills, no matter what level of government you're talking about, you have to make sure that they know that not only are there incentives for them to do so, but that there will be consequences for them being obstructionists. And now that we're looking at, across the nation, polling numbers where, as long as if people consider cannabis to be a priority issue, those polling numbers can swing entire elections. And we've actually seen this, outside of polling in actual elections when, ballot initiatives to legalize cannabis for adult use have outperformed presidential candidates and candidates for Senate and candidates for House of Representatives and candidates for governor. It's pretty clear that legalization and reform are more popular than pretty much any politician across the board. And so once politicians realize that this is an issue that can actually swing elections, they start paying a lot more attention and start getting much more educated about the issue. They start getting more nuanced views on the issue. But oftentimes they will lose some of the important points when they get really driven down into the nuances of policy. And unless they have consumers and people that have been impacted by prohibition to them on a regular basis and telling them what they want and what sort of policies they want to see, sometimes the good parts of, or like I guess the really good parts that are focused on consumers can get lost in the shuffle. So, it's not only important to maintain contact and relationships with your lawmakers and make sure that they're hearing from you on a regular basis, but you have to continue those and reach out to other people to try to get them involved, because nothing happens in a vacuum.
No, absolutely not. It's you talking about them being unaware and whatnot. When I first got involved at the legislative level, both here in Texas and as well in DC, I was with National Norml in 2019 at the National Norml Convention and Lobby Day. And one of the biggest things I figured out was they don't know, most of them. They have no idea because they haven't looked into it. One of the number one comebacks in 2019 that I was faced with was, well, we just don't have enough research. And while we don't have enough of the right kinds of research, there are literally tons and tons of research out there on cannabis used as medicine from a preclinical standpoint, right? So when I started showing these lawmakers some of this preclinical research and some of the results and some of the peer-reviewed studies and whatnot, and they're like, wait a minute, maybe there is something to this. And then they were open to the actual conversations. So yeah, it's imperative to have these conversations. Where they get their information from is a lot of times from their constituents. So we're going to take a quick sponsor break. And when we come back, we're going to do just that right after this.
Howdy, Colt Power here. These days, many people are choosing to add CBD to their wellness routine. Why? Some like CBD for how it may help them with their focus. Others enjoy the way the plant compound may assist them with their sore muscles and relaxation. For me, CBD has been a game changer in keeping my old sports injuries managed so I can work out and be present for my family. If you've ever been curious about CBD, I invite you to check out our Texas-grown, Texas-made products at powerbiofarms.com. That's power, BIOPHARMS.com.
Thrive Apothecary offers an experience truly unique from anything else in Texas. A full-service cannabis solution that is doctor-owned and offers customers every level of cannabis legally available in Texas. From traditional CBD products to emerging hemp-derived THC edibles, smokables, and now medical cannabis. As a licensed medical cannabis provider, prospective patients from anywhere in Texas can book a sponsored online eligibility consultation to determine if they qualify for a medical marijuana prescription from the comfort of their own home. Visit thrivetx.com for more information.
Welcome back to the Lone Star Collective podcast, the official podcast of the Texas Cannabis Collective, distributed on Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts, and many more, to give Texans information regarding policy, industry, and culture. And now, back to this week's show.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things that Norml likes to try to focus on, is making sure that we can provide voters and advocates with the best information possible in order to make the best case possible. Now, some of this is always contingent on lawmakers actually being able to read a scientific study or even a summary of it. But, I think that it's important for people to go into these meetings and conversations with their lawmakers as prepared and informed as possible. Just give them the facts, as well as what your personal preferences are in terms of policy. But they don't necessarily need to hear any sort of long history of your involvement in cannabis policy reform. They want human interest stories, but they don't necessarily need to hear your resume. They want to see studies, but they also want them simplified and put together in terms of how you can best view them as they relate to policy. There's a lot of things that you can do to maximize your impact as a citizen lobbyist. And really, anytime you send a letter to your lawmakers, you are a lobbyist now.
Yeah. That's because that's what you're doing. You're lobbying for something you believe in, right?
Yeah. There's good ways and bad ways to do that. But it needs to be done. It's really impactful when it's coming from constituents in particular. I mean, heck, I know lawmakers that really won't listen to any sort of a pitch unless it has some direct relationship to their constituency. But there are others that are really interested in getting educated about all sorts of issues, and as well as cannabis policy reform. So, it really depends on who you're talking to, but you got to make the effort if you want to see change. That's the bottom line. And so we try to endeavor to prepare people to do that and to make it as easy for them to do so as possible. But I think that it's equally important for everybody out there that supports legalization and whether or not you're a cannabis consumer, to proactively educate yourself about the issue and to stay involved even after your direct interest in it has been solved. Because not only are we all in this together, and you got to look out for the people for cannabis consumers elsewhere. Otherwise, things can swing back. The pendulum can swing backwards. So, the more help we can provide to people that do not have the same sort of legal access that we might, and the same sort of legal protections that we might, depending on what state or locality you're in, we kind of owe it to everybody else to help them as well, because that help can come back. in really, really
Yeah.
big ways when you end up getting challenged on various things, but also because, we very easily could see a lot of the progress that we've made get rolled back if the right political conditions are met. And that would be really disappointing if everybody that worked so hard to get to the point where they had legal access had just kind of fallen by the wayside and not kept their their activist tools sharp.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Morgan, I know you're in a rush, and I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule and your busy day to join us and have a little brief conversation with us. Real quick, before we cut this thing off, tell everybody where they can find National Norml and how they can get involved.
Well, you can just go to norml.org. And also, if you want to contact your federal lawmakers, there are a number of ways to do so. If you go to norml.org/act, there's also a lot of ways so you can contact your state lawmakers and officials if you're in a state that happens to be considering cannabis policy reform legislation. Right now, that might be not a whole lot of them, but come January, state legislative sessions are going to start to heat up real big. And, as we've seen over the last couple of years, states continue to lead the way. Even though we're getting more momentum in Congress, but states continue blowing it out of the park.
Well, I think the states that are continuing to make change are what's leading the efforts at the national level. That's what's kind of not necessarily leading it, but driving it. Same as here in Texas, what we've started before the last session, or between the last two sessions, was we started doing a lot of local decrim efforts. We got 5 of them passed. That opened a lot of eyes in Austin this past session. So, of course, what we're continuing to work on is more and more decrim efforts in cities like Lubbock. We're fixing to start one, I think, after the first of the year in Dallas, and more. So the more things we can do on that level, I think will help us on the state level as well. Just like you say, at the national level, these states changing laws are what's driving the national movement, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, Chris, you're 100% right, because, every single state that has, passed legalization, well, particularly the early ones, you saw a lot of local efforts to either decriminalize or set cannabis as lowest law enforcement priority. And that has been, a significant pattern around the country. I mean, they say that all politics is local, and there are some things that you can't do at the local level that you can only do at the state level. There are some things that you can't do at the state level that you can only do at the federal level. But until you start getting that groundswell, you're not going to start to see traction at the higher levels of government, no matter what that level happens to be. So, I know that that a lot of the Texas localities that passed decrim and LLEP laws are being challenged right now. And, while that is definitely unfortunate, it does help gain attention to those efforts and really send a message that this is something that the people want, and elected officials are actively fighting against it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to thank you again, Morgan, for joining us. And anytime you've got something you want to talk about, feel free to join us again. We love having people from the national scene come on and tell us what's going on at the national level. We have viewership from the national level as well. So once again, thanks again for coming on and explaining a little bit of what's going on at the national level and how people can get it more involved.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to come back anytime, and we should definitely circle back up at the beginning of the next congressional year, I guess, and go over what potential changes we might be seeing, and see if there's been any sort of changes in the lay of the land for the rest of the session.
Absolutely, we'll sure do that. Thanks again. That's going to wrap it up for the show this week, folks. And thank y'all for joining us. As always, we enjoy having the conversations. We'd like to have y'all back with us every week. So be sure and come back.